Good afternoon. It's 4 p.m. here in Seoul and you're watching Arirang News. Coming to you live from Seoul, I'm Kwon Jang-won and it's good to have you with us. Vice Minister level officials from over 50 countries and international organizations have gathered here in the South Korean capital to attend the Seoul Defense Dialogue. The annual security forum comes amid drastic changes in the situation on the Korean Peninsula over the last year. I'll be sitting down with one of the organisers of the event later in the show, but first we turn to Devin waiting at the News Centre, who has the latest developments on the inter-Korean relations. Devin?
Hi, Jang-ho. The South Korean government made it official today that the two Koreas will open their joint liaison office this Friday at the Kaesong Industrial Complex just north of the border. It was part of the Panmunjom Declaration signed by the leaders of the two Koreas in April. Our Unification Ministry correspondent Oh Jung-hee tells us more.
A contact office that enables communication between the two Koreas 24/7 all year round. For the first time in history, South and North Korea will be running a joint liaison office together, and it'll be within the Kaesong Industrial Complex, a factory park the two Koreas ran together until February 2016. The grand opening will take place on Friday with 50 to 60 attendees from each side of the border. South Korea's Unification Minister Cho Myung-gyun and his North Korean counterpart Lee Sun-kwon, who heads the North's Reunification Committee, will be signing and exchanging an agreement on running the contact office.
The office will be in charge of overseeing constant contact between the two Koreas, discussions for inter-Korean talks, and providing support for civilian exchanges. Officials from the Land, Forest, and Culture ministries will also be staying.
Vice ministerial level officials from the two Koreas will be heading the office. South Korea will be appointing the Vice Unification Minister Chun Hae-sung as its head, and North Korea plans to appoint its vice head of the Reunification Committee as Chun's counterpart. They'll serve as representatives whenever meetings take place. 15 to 20 officials each from Seoul and Pyongyang will be at the contact office.
The joint liaison office will become an ordinary communication channel for improving inter-Korean relations, lowering military tensions and bringing peace to the Korean Peninsula. We expect it will contribute to keeping inter-Korean relations stable and helping North Korea-US nuclear negotiations.
The Joint Liaison Office can serve as the foundation for sustainable and institutionalized inter-Korean relations. Seoul says the two Koreas aim to ultimately set up resident representative offices in each other's capitals. Oh Jung-hee, Arirang News.
South Korea's Moon Jae-in administration has submitted a motion to Parliament that would have the legislature ratify the Panmunjom Declaration and make it law. The government wants it passed ahead of next week's Inter-Korean Summit. The motion, sent Tuesday by the Unification Ministry, is aimed at enhancing cross-border cooperation and exchanges and pursuing the Korean Peninsula's complete denuclearization. It also includes an estimate for the cost of implementing part of the agreement next year, which amounts to more than $260 million. The cost includes the estimated outlays for inter-Korean cooperation on railways, roads, and forestry. Since his arrival in Seoul a couple of months ago, the U.S. ambassador to South Korea, Harry Harris, has kept a low profile, but he gave an optimistic speech Tuesday at a forum in Seoul about the Seoul-Washington alliance and building bridges with North Korea. EG1 reports.
Hope is a weapon in diplomacy. U.S. Ambassador to South Korea Harry Harris shared a statement he found profound to the audience at the 48th Forest Forum in Seoul. The former U.S. Pacific Command commander said on Tuesday that Seoul and Washington are in the very early days of their experiment in the denuclearization of North Korea, and while it may or may not turn out well, it's okay to be hopeful and optimistic.
I think we have a great opportunity ahead of us because of the work of both of our presidents. We are in an unimaginable place. I could not imagine what I saw in Singapore or what I saw in Panmunjom even a year ago when I was the Pacific Command commander. That to me was unimaginable, and yet here we are today.
Harris backed up his statements by saying how much confidence President Trump has that North Korean leader Kim Jong-un will keep his promise to dismantle the regime's nuclear program, as sealed by their handshake at the June 12 summit in Singapore. North Korea's human rights violations were also raised, with the ambassador saying the U.S. remains deeply concerned. Harris assured that the U.S. will remain sensitive to the issue and continue working with the international community to solve it, like exposing the issue to people around the world. Asked about the possibility of reducing the U.S. troop presence in the South, Harris said despite numerous reports, such a move is not being contemplated. He went on to credit American troops in the South, the South Korean military, and their joint forces for having played a significant role in bringing the two allies back to the table with the North. Harris said such an ironclad alliance is what built mutual security and co-economic prosperity for both sides, and that maintaining those strong ties is one of his top priorities as the U.S. ambassador to South Korea. 이지원, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping sat down for talks in Vladivostok on Tuesday to discuss their bilateral relations and ways to safeguard world peace and trade. Kim Yo-sun reports.
Russian President Vladimir Putin and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping showcased their close friendship on Tuesday as they met in Vladivostok on the sidelines of the annual Eastern Economic Forum. After holding one-on-one talks, the two leaders met again more casually, this time wearing kitchen aprons. They demonstrated their cooking skills by frying traditional Russian pancakes known as blini. While praising the efforts taken by the leaders of the two Koreas to restore their relations, Putin highlighted Washington's role in the process.
We believe that an important element of general process of settlement of the situation around the Korean Peninsula is normalization of the relations between North Korea and the U.S.
Referring to the roadmap laid out by Russia and China last year, the two leaders also pledged to cooperate to solve the North's nuclear issue through diplomacy. President Xi highlighted that the two countries share common interest in many international issues and called for the need to cooperate more going forward. He also made clear that they should fight unilateralism and trade protectionism worldwide in an apparent response to the Trump administration's trade policies. Putin and Xi also pledged to broaden the scope of cooperation in all areas, including investment, energy, and finance. Kim Yo-sun, Arirang News.
A Korean man was recently diagnosed with Middle East respiratory syndrome, or MERS, after a trip to Kuwait. To make sure the virus doesn't spread, the authorities are checking the dozens of people who came in contact with the man. So far, they say 10 people have tested negative for it. Yoon Jung-min reports.
All 10 people who were tested after coming into contact with a man recently diagnosed with MERS have been confirmed free of the virus as of Wednesday. The discharged patients, however, still remain on the quarantine agency's watch list. On Tuesday, a passenger from Dubai showed similar symptoms and was quarantined in a medical center on arrival. The Korea Centers for Disease Control and Prevention are keeping a close eye on dozens of others who came into contact with the first patient, including passengers, flight attendants, and medical workers. Those people have been placed under quarantine at home. Health authorities were criticized, however, as the original patient was carried to hospital by an ordinary ambulance rather than the one designed to block air circulation. The deadly virus easily spreads through the air, and patients require a special facility to prevent contaminated air spreading. The health authorities earlier said they used a special ambulance, but it was later found to be false. The government is tracking those who contacted the first patient, but the whereabouts of some 30 people still remains unknown. The Seoul metropolitan government also launched a task force to tackle the virus ahead of the country's major Chuseok holiday later this month. The original patient was diagnosed with MERS and hospitalized on Saturday after he returned home from a business trip in Kuwait. Korea was hit hard by an outbreak in 2015, which infected more than 180 people nationwide and caused 38 deaths. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
I'm Devin Whiting, and those are your news headlines.
The situation on the Korean Peninsula has seen some dramatic developments in recent months, from the threat of nuclear war last year to now new levels of inter-Korean cooperation. In the midst of all this, now South Korea will be holding its annual Security and Defense Forum in the capital this week. Military officials and experts from all over the world will be gathered to take part in the Seoul defense dialogue, and there is particularly keen interest this year. Many will be wondering how changes in the relationship with North Korea will affect the security and safety in the region. To tell us more, we have with us the Deputy Director General for International Policy, Army Brigadier General Park Chul-gyun from the Seoul's Ministry of Defense. It's an honor to have you on the show today.
My pleasure.
Now, I would like to start with first, if you could briefly introduce yourself, because I think our viewers would be very curious, especially in your impressive uniform. And also, can you tell us more about the Seoul Defense Dialogue, which you're here to talk about?
Yeah, as already mentioned, I'm Brigadier General Park Chul-gyun, and Deputy Director General for International Policy, taking care of all defense diplomatic affairs all over the world.
Now, can you tell us a little bit more about the Seoul Defense Dialogue, what it's about and what the aim is for the government?
Well, the Seoul Defense Dialogue is a vice-ministerial multilateral security dialogue. It was started in 2012 to make relevant government officials, experts come together, share opinions, and come up with ideas for the peace and security of the Korean Peninsula and the globe. This year is the 7th year. The Seoul Defense Dialogue is growing in both quality and quantity with the increasing participants and diversifying agendas. This year, SDD has highest number, 52 countries participating, especially UK, UAE, and Uzbekistan are sending their vice ministers for the first time. It seems to reflect the international community's high interest in the Korean Peninsula.
So yes, as you just said, 52 countries and 5 international organizations taking part, I understand. Now, in the first year, there was 15 nations and 2 international organizations. That's quite a growth in 7 years, as you've said. Do you think this shows the level of interest that the issues, the circumstances on the Korean Peninsula, especially with North Korea, has taken hold for the people in the world?
Yeah, I do think so. The denuclearization and the establishment of the peace regime on the Korean Peninsula are the global security issues. Do you recall last year's escalation to the brink of a war? It had a tremendous influence on peace and stability of both the Korean Peninsula and the globe. However, currently the Korean Peninsula is on a path of a dialogue without provocation for almost 300 days since the last missile launch. To my memory, we are experiencing one of the most prolonged peace on the Korean Peninsula since the Armistice Agreement. Though there are still many tasks to achieve complete denuclearization, yet its realization would contribute significantly to build the globally peaceful security environment. That being said, the international community is observing closely on how such matters will unfold.
I think when you held this forum last year, it would have been a very different environment, a very different atmosphere from this year. And I think that's reflected in the title for this year's event, which is Sustainable Peace from Conflict to Cooperation. Can you tell us about the events, how the events of the last few months have shaped the Seoul Defense Dialogue for this year? Has there been increased interest from international observers as well?
With the heightened threat from North Korea last year, the main agenda for the previous year's SDD was North Korea's nuclear and missile threat and the security of the Korean Peninsula. However, this year, as we are all aware, with the historical inter-Korean and the US-North Korean summit, discussions and measures for peace are being undertaken. Reflecting such a development, we have chosen sustainable peace as the main theme of this year's Seoul Defense Dialogue, and also denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and establishment of a peace regime as the theme of the plenary session 1, to gain wisdom through earnest discussion among distinguished global security experts.
In your preparations for this event, I'm sure you'll have talked to many of the counterparts that you'll be meeting coming to Korea. What has their response been over events of the last year? What are they interested in, and what are they looking to get out of this, this forum this year?
Well, the North Korean nuclear issue has been on the table for a while. And the international community has already come together to address the issue. We cannot deny that the international community's cooperative efforts played an integral role in bringing North Korea to the dialogue table. While Republic of Korea and the United States played a leading role, establishment of a peace regime and denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula require international community's cooperation in various fields. Establishment of the peace regime can only be achieved with the agreement and support from not only neighboring nations such as the United States and China, but also the entire international community. Denuclearization also requires international cooperation in various fields, including experts and technical support, as well as cost and information sharing. This year's Seoul Defense Dialogue will provide the opportunity to share thoughts and ideas regarding these issues.
Now, as we mentioned, it's a very critical time with Korean Peninsula affairs, and this kind of forum is a way for nations to communicate as well. But how is the South Korean government and military working together with the other partners in the region to make sure, that we secure peace and security in the Korean Peninsula?
The Korean Peninsula and the Northeast Asia are geopolitical crossroads between the continental and maritime powers. Historically, during periods of distrust and competition, Northeast Asia has experienced conflict. It is therefore necessary for us to establish an environment of trust and cooperation. To realize such a cooperative framework, Republic of Korea Ministry of National Defense continues to exchange and cooperation, as well as communication and dialogue with our neighboring countries. Centered around the solid ROK-US alliance, Republic of Korea Ministry of National Defense currently endeavors in various efforts with China, Japan, and Russia. Those efforts are strategic dialogues, exchange visits between senior officials, training exchange, and establishing channels for meal-to-meal confidence building.
So what was also very interesting this year was the fact that North Korea had been invited to take part in the event which happened during the last military talks that the two Koreas had. Unfortunately, North Korea said they declined the invitation, saying that the two Koreas need to focus more on carrying out the Panmunjom Declaration for now. Yeah. How much is it a shame that not to have North Korea involved this year? And what do you think it could have been like if they had been involved?
Yeah, actually we provide the invitation on the 31st of July during the general office level meal-to-meal talks in Panmunjom. And then we waited about a month, and then they sent us a message that they would not participate in the Seoul Defense Dialogue. So it is a kind of shame, and then we really hope that it would have been possible for them to participate.
If I ask one more question, if they had been involved, how do you think it would have changed the atmosphere? How do you think it would have affected how the Seoul Defense Dialogue would have run?
Well, with their participation, it would have been more dynamic and more active to have a real discussions regarding the security of the Korean Peninsula. But also, I think that considering their kind of systems and then their kind of a way of act, that it would have also very difficult for them to participate like us freely and dynamically in various issues.
Yes, I think it would have been very interesting to see them there. Hopefully in the future sometime we'll be able to get them in Seoul to take part in this sort of defense dialogue as well. Now, if you move on to another issue, someone who was invited before, but this year is coming, is China. Now, so for the last 2 years, China has not been involved because of the dispute with South Korea over the issue of the US missile defense system, THAAD. Now, since then, the relationship has been mended somewhat, and now they are coming back to Seoul. How significant is it that they are coming back to the defense dialogue and expressing their voice, and what can they bring to the event?
Well, as you have mentioned, China is sending a delegation composed of 9 members, headed by General Lee Maoji. China's participation in this year's Seoul Defense Dialogue signifies the restoration of the bilateral military relationship, especially after the summit in last December. We will normalize defense relations between two countries by the end of this year through senior officials meetings and defense cooperation.
Having China back in the mix, like how do you feel that changes the conversation in the dialogue? Because obviously they're a very big player in this region, and they have a lot of stake in for military-wise in this region. How does having them back change things?
Well, to bring about the real peace and security in this region, China cannot be excluded. They have a big influence, as you said. They are a big country, so with the participation of China, we can have a more realistic and substantial discussion regarding various issues.
Of course, the Seoul Defense Dialogue is not just about the North Korea issue. It's a global forum that's aimed to look at the other military and security concerns. What else is going to be covered this year?
There will be many issues, not only the denuclearization and peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. We'll discuss about strategic balance in Northeast Asia, cybersecurity issues, maritime security issues, and then energy security issues. All those issues will be very globally interesting issues.
I think one of the issues you mentioned there was cybersecurity, and advances in technology nowadays must surely be a challenge for any nation's military. Part of the so-called fourth industrial effect, you might call it. How much of a topic has it grown at the Seoul Defense Dialogue over the years?
Cyber attack is dangerous enough to paralyze the whole nation, considering the level of how much the national infrastructures and our daily lives are dependent. Many countries are putting their utmost efforts to enhance their cybersecurity capabilities. However, these efforts are facing difficulties because of ambiguity in identifying the attackers and the lack of relevant international norms. Therefore, multilateral cooperation on cybersecurity is becoming more and more important, and the international community's cooperation for the standardization of a cybersecurity measure is required more than ever. Seoul Defense Dialogue has been hosting the Cyber Working Group since 2014, the director-level meeting for the practical cooperation and then discussion. Marking its 5th year, this year's Cyber Working Group will invite 20 countries to discuss tangible cooperation measures.
Let me ask you a bit more on that. Other than the cyber attacks, what other kind of advancing technology are there that are disrupting the traditional kind of military tactics and military planning and the safety and security of countries? And what do you think will be discussed in your dialogue as well?
Well, one of the issues that we are going to discuss is the extremism, terrorism. So under that issue, the relevant countries and participants will have a very proactive discussions too.
So having the Seoul Defense Dialogue, having it in Korea, in this part of the world, how important is it? Because, I mean, I'm sure there are defense dialogues and security forums all over the world, but having it in South Korea and in this region, why is it important?
As we have already discussed, the world is observing the dynamic security situations on the Korean Peninsula. With the Inter-Korean Summit and North Korea and the United States Summit, many things are changing in a very rapid speed. So the hosting the Seoul Defense Dialogue in Seoul will have a significant meaning for all the participants. So as I said, there are many newcomers for this year's Seoul Defense Dialogue.
And finally, what do you think needs to be done moving ahead now, looking ahead to the future of the Korean Peninsula? What needs to cooperation needs to happen and amongst the partners in the region?
As already mentioned, the various global security threats cannot be countered by a single nation. So in order to effectively respond to such threats, the Republic of Korea Ministry of National Defense and the Republic of Korea's armed forces shall actively cooperate with other countries. That being said, this year's Seoul Defense Dialogue will contribute greatly to this end.
Well, thank you for coming in today and sharing us your time and introducing us more about the Seoul Defense Dialogue, and hope to see you again in the future.
Thank you.
Now, that's all from me for today, but do tune in to our later newscasts throughout the day for all the latest from Korea and around the world. Thank you for watching, and goodbye for now.